The clatter of porcelain on porcelain was the metronome of Amara's life. It set the rhythm of her days, the hurried beat of the lunch rush, the languid adagio of late-night diners nursing their final cognacs. Tonight, at the Onyx Room, the rhythm was tense, a staccato of nerves. Every patron in the sprawling, dimly lit space seemed to be holding their breath, their spines a little straighter, their voices a little lower. It was because of him. Nico Volpe did not command a room with noise or grand gestures. He commanded it with silence. He sat at his usual corner table, a booth of dark red leather that curved around him like a cupped hand, shadowed and discreet. He was a man carved from stillness, his suit a slash of perfect charcoal against the crimson upholstery, his face a study in impassive angles. Only his eyes moved, dark and quick, missing nothing. They called him the Shadow. In the whispers that scurried through the city's underbelly, a name that spoke of his quiet omnipresence and the darkness that trailed him like a cloak. Amara had served him half a dozen times. Her hands had never trembled before. Tonight they did. It wasn't because of Nico himself, but because of the man who had just left his table, his cousin, Marco Vella. Marco was all smiles and slicked back hair, a stark contrast to Nico's unnerving composure. He had leaned in close, clapping a familiar hand on Nico's shoulder, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur that Amara, standing by the service station, had strained to hear. It wasn't the words that had chilled her, but the furtive movement that followed. As Marco straightened up, his hand had brushed past Nico's untouched glass of whiskey, and for a fraction of a second his thumb had hooked over the rim. A small, almost imperceptible dip. A faint, powdery residue had clouded the amber liquid for a moment before dissolving completely. Her heart had seized in her chest. It was a movement so swift, so practiced, it could only be deliberate. She had seen men like Marco before, men whose smiles were weapons and whose affection was poison. She had learned to read the subtle tells of deceit in the tight corners of a mouth, the too steady gaze. This was different. This was not a lie meant to swindle or seduce. This was a lie meant to end a life. For a full minute, Amara was frozen, a statue in her starched black uniform, the heavy silver tray in her hand, feeling like an anchor drowning her. She could do nothing, say nothing. To interfere was to sign her own death warrant. Nico Volpe was a dangerous man, but the kind of man who would poison his own blood was a monster of a different sort. Getting caught between them was a form of suicide. She should turn away, go back to the kitchen, polish silverware, pretend she was a ghost, unseen and unheard. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, her tired eyes, the medical bills piled on their small kitchen table. Amara was not a hero. She was a survivor, a provider. Her job was to be invisible, to anticipate needs for salt or water, not to meddle in the affairs of men who settled their disputes in blood. But then she looked at Nico Volpe again. He was staring into the middle distance, his expression unreadable, his hand resting on the table mere inches from the glass. There was something profoundly lonely in his stillness, a solitude that seemed to emanate from him like a physical cold. He was a predator, yes, the city knew that. But in that moment he was also just a man about to drink poison, betrayed by his own kin. And Amara's conscience, a stubborn, unyielding thing she had inherited from her grandmother, refused to let her walk away. It was a foolish, reckless impulse, but it was hers. Her mind raced, a frantic search for a plan. She couldn't cause a scene, couldn't shout a warning. Marco was likely still in the restaurant, watching. She needed a message, silent and urgent. Her hand dove into her apron pocket, fumbling for her small order pad. Her fingers, slick with a sudden cold sweat, closed around the stub of a pencil. Tearing off a small sheet, she braced it against the side of the silver tray and wrote, her script tight, and rushed. Don't drink it. Smile. and leave now." The words looked stark and insane on the little piece of paper. This was madness. She was a waitress. She refilled water glasses and described the specials. She did not pass cryptic warnings to Mafia bosses. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she picked up a water pitcher, the condensation cold against her trembling palm. This would be her excuse, her cover. She approached the table, her steps measured, her gaze fixed on the water glass next to his whiskey, avoiding the lethal one. Her entire world had narrowed to that small 4-foot space. The low hum of conversation, the distant clink of a fork, the soft jazz from the corner trio, it all faded into a dull roar in her ears. "More water, Mr. Volpe?" she asked, her voice a stranger's, miraculously steady. He didn't look up at first. He simply gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. As she leaned in to pour, her body shielding his table from the rest of the room, her other hand moved, quick as a serpent's strike. She slipped the folded note onto the leather seat beside his thigh, her fingers brushing the cool, expensive wool of his trousers. She pulled back, placing the pitcher on her tray, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Had he noticed? Had anyone else? She chanced to glance around the room. No one seemed to be paying them any mind. Marco was at the bar, his back to them, laughing with the bartender. She waited for what felt like an eternity. Nico remained motionless. Did he not feel it? Was he going to ignore it? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. Then, slowly, his hand moved from the tabletop and dropped to his side, his fingers closing over the note. He didn't look down. He didn't react at all. For a terrible moment, she thought he was going to dismiss it, to simply crumple it in his fist. He raised his head, and his eyes met hers. They were darker than she had realized, not black, but the deep, bottomless brown of a forest at midnight. And for the first time, they were focused entirely on her. It felt like being pinned by a physical weight. There was no anger in his gaze, no confusion. There was only a terrifying, assessing stillness, an intelligence that seemed to strip away her uniform, her rehearsed pleasantries, her very skin, and see the frantic, terrified heart beneath. He brought the note up, keeping it below the level of the table, and unfolded it with one hand. His eyes scanned the words. The corner of his mouth, which she had never seen move in any direction but a straight, severe line, twitched. He looked from the note to the glass of whiskey and then back to her. A silent, chilling conversation passed between them in that single look. He knew, he understood the warning, and he understood the risk she had taken. What happened next she had not anticipated. She expected him to nod, to stand, to leave. She expected to be able to retreat into the shadows of the restaurant and pray he would forget her face. Instead, a slow, predatory smile spread across his lips. It was not a genuine smile. It held no warmth, no humor. It was a performance, a sharp and dangerous baring of teeth for the benefit of whoever might be watching. It was the smile of a wolf. He folded the note, tucked it into his pocket, and then his hand shot out, fast as thought, and clamped around her wrist. His grip was not brutal, but it was absolute. A manacle of warm, living steel. Her breath hitched, a small, audible gasp. The silver tray clattered against the table's edge, the pitcher rattling. "Thank you, my dear," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that was somehow more menacing than a shout. He stood, pulling her with him, her body stumbling against the side of the table. He never broke eye contact. "Your service has been exceptional." He dropped a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover his drink, and then he began to walk, towing her behind him like a prize or a prisoner. Her mind screamed. This was wrong. This was not the plan. The plan was for him to leave, not for him to take her with him. He moved through the restaurant with an unhurried grace that belied the iron strength in his grip. Patrons averted their gazes. The maitre d', a man who prided himself on his unflappable authority, simply nodded, his eyes wide. Amara was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. Her apron felt ridiculously out of place, her sensible black shoes scuffing on the polished marble floor as she struggled to keep up. He didn't stop until they were outside, in the cool, damp night air. The city lights seemed to blur around her. A long, black car, sleek and silent as a shark, pulled up to the EC curb, a driver jumping out to open the rear door. Nico Volpe finally looked down at her, his smile gone, his face once again an impenetrable mask. His grip on her wrist loosened slightly, but did not release. "You have 5 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't believe you're part of a very clumsy trap," he said, his voice soft, deadly. "The man," she stammered, her words tumbling out. "Your cousin, Marco, he put something in your drink. I saw him, his thumb over the rim." Nico's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, confirmation perhaps, in their depths. He studied her face, searching for a lie, for any hint of duplicity. She met his gaze, her terror giving way to a desperate, defiant honesty. She had done the right thing, the stupidest, most reckless thing in her life, and she would not be mistaken for an accomplice. He seemed to find what he was looking for. He gave a single sharp nod. "Get in the car." It wasn't a request. Amara stood frozen for a second, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She had saved a man's life, and in doing so had irrevocably destroyed her own. She was no longer Amara, the waitress. She was a witness, a loose end, a complication in a world she couldn't possibly comprehend. I can't," she whispered, pulling back against his grip. "My job. My mother?" "Your job is over," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "As for your mother, she's safer if you're with me than if you're left alone for my cousin to find. Now get in the car." He opened the door wider, a gesture that was both a courtesy and a command. The interior was dark, smelling of rich leather and something else, something clean and metallic. It felt like a cage. It felt like the only safe place in the world. With a heart full of dread, Amara surrendered. She let him guide her into the back seat, sliding across the cool leather. He followed her in, the door closing with a solid, final thud that sealed her off from everything she had ever known. The car pulled away from the curb, melting into the river of city traffic, and Amara watched the familiar lights of the Onyx Room, her former life, disappear behind them. She was in the shadow now, and she had no idea if the dawn would ever come. The silence in the car was a living entity, thick and suffocating. It pressed in on Amara from all sides, amplifying the soft hum of the engine and the frantic thrumming of her own pulse. She sat rigidly on her side of the expansive leather seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the starched fabric of her apron a flimsy shield against the sheer unreality of the moment. She could feel Nico Volpe's presence beside her, not as a warmth, but as a void, a pocket of intense gravity that pulled all the air and light towards him. She risked a sideways glance. He was staring out the window, his profile etched against the fleeting neon signs of the city. His face gave away nothing. It was a mask of placid control, but she could see the tension in the line of his jaw, the way his fingers rested, perfectly still, on his knee. He was a man coiled, a spring wound tight. He had just been the target of an assassination attempt by his own family, yet his composure was absolute. It was terrifying. What had she done? The question screamed in her mind. She had acted on a single, righteous impulse, and now she was trapped in a luxury automobile with a man whose reputation was built on violence and fear. Every instinct told her to run, to throw open the door at the next red light and disappear into the crowd. But the cold logic of his words echoed in her ears. "She's safer if you're with me than if you're left alone for my cousin to find." Marco knew she had been at the table. He would have seen Nico pull her away. He would assume she had said something, warned him. She was a witness, a loose end. The thought sent a tremor of pure fear through her. The car turned off the main thoroughfare, gliding into a neighborhood of stately brownstones and tree-lined streets where the city's roar softened to a distant murmur. It stopped before a building that was less an apartment complex and more a fortress of limestone and glass, a gleaming tower that pierced the night sky. A private underground garage door slid open, and the car descended into a clean, brightly lit space that was empty save for one other vehicle identical to their own. The driver, a burly man with a face like a stone carving, remained in his seat, his eyes forward. The silence stretched. "My name is Amara," she said, the words feeling small and fragile in the vast quiet. She didn't know why she said it, perhaps to remind herself that she was a person with a name, not just a piece of collateral. Nico turned his head slowly, his dark eyes fixing on her. "I know," he said. The simple statement was unnerving. Of course he knew. He was Nico Volpe. He probably knew her mother's name and the brand of tea she drank. He got out of the car, and Amara scrambled to follow, her legs unsteady. He led her to a private elevator, the doors hissing open at his approach. Inside, he pressed the button for the penthouse, the highest floor, without a word. The ascent was swift and silent. Amara's ears popped. She felt as though she were rising to another world, leaving the ground, and everything familiar far below. The elevator doors opened directly into a sprawling living space. Amara's first impression was of scale and emptiness. The ceilings were impossibly high, the windows vast sheets of glass that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the city's glittering expanse. The furniture was minimalist and modern. Low-slung sofas in pale gray, a glass coffee table that seemed to float stark abstract art on the walls. It was a palace of glass and stone, meticulously clean, breathtakingly expensive, and as cold and impersonal as a museum. There were no photographs, no clutter, no sign that a human being actually lived here. It was a space designed to be looked at, not inhabited. A woman emerged from a hallway, wiping her hands on an apron. She was older, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face etched with lines of worry and disapproval. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in Amara's waitress uniform and the situation with a quick, sweeping glance. "Sophia," Nico said, his voice flat. "This is Amara. She will be staying with us. Show her to the east guest room. See that she has everything she needs." Sophia's gaze lingered on Amara, a mixture of suspicion and pity. "Of course, Mr. Volpe." Nico turned his attention back to Amara, his expression unyielding. "You will not leave this apartment. You will not contact anyone. My driver will collect your personal effects from your home tomorrow. You will give Sophia your mother's contact information. She will be informed that you have taken a sudden high-paying private domestic position that requires you to live on site. She will also be provided for. Her bills will be paid. She will want for nothing. Do you understand?" Each sentence was a command, a brick in the wall of her new prison. He was not just confining her, he was methodically erasing her life and replacing it with one of his own design. The thought of her mother, of some stranger from Nico Volpe's world showing up at her door, made her feel sick. "You can't just—" she started, her voice trembling with a desperate surge of defiance. "I can," he interrupted, his tone cutting like glass. "And I have. You made a choice tonight, Amara. You involved yourself. Now you will see the consequences. You are a vulnerability, both to me and to yourself. My protection is not a request. It is a fact of your life, for now. Sophia will answer any practical questions you have." He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing down a long, sterile hallway, leaving her standing in the cavernous room with the stern housekeeper. The authority with which he moved, the absolute certainty in his voice, left no room for argument. He was a man accustomed to his will being law. "Come," Sophia said, her voice softer than her expression, though no less firm. She led Amara down a different hallway, this one lined with closed doors. The silence of the apartment was unnerving. It was a home without the sounds of a home. The guest room was, like the rest of the penthouse, impeccably furnished and utterly devoid of personality. A large bed with a crisp white duvet, a sleek wooden dresser, an attached bathroom of gleaming marble. It was more luxurious than any hotel Amara had ever imagined, and it felt more like a cell than her tiny, cluttered bedroom at home. "There are clothes in the closet," Sophia said, gesturing to a set of louvered doors. "Basic things. They should fit. If you require anything else, tell." "Me?" She paused, her gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "He is not a monster, child. He is a careful man. You did a brave thing tonight. Now you must be a clever girl and do as you are told. It is the safest path for everyone." With that piece of cryptic advice, Sophia left, closing the door softly behind her. Amara was alone. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress far too soft, and finally allowed the tremors to rack her body. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cheap polyester of her uniform a pathetic reminder of the simple, ordinary life that had been snatched away from her only an hour ago. She had done a brave thing, and her reward was a gilded cage guarded by a man made of shadows and silence. She thought of the glass of poisoned whiskey, of Marco's treacherous smile, and of Nico's hand on her wrist. She had stepped out of the light and into his world, and now she was trapped in its cold, beautiful, terrifying twilight. Sleep offered no escape. She drifted in and out of a restless doze, haunted by dreams of falling from the great glass windows of the penthouse. She woke with a start, the pale gray light of dawn filtering into the room, disoriented and aching. For a disbelieving moment she thought it had all been a nightmare. But the unfamiliar silk of the pajamas she'd found in the closet and the oppressive silence of the apartment quickly dispelled that fantasy. She showered in the marble bathroom, the water pressure almost painfully strong, and dressed in a simple pair of black trousers and a soft cashmere sweater from the anonymous collection in the closet. The clothes fit perfectly, a fact she found more unsettling than comforting. It spoke of a chilling efficiency, a world where needs were anticipated and provided for with an impersonal, silent precision. Hesitantly, she made her way back to the main living area. The apartment was still silent. The morning sun streamed through the vast windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and throwing long, sharp shadows across the polished floors. The city below was waking up, a distant, muffled hum of traffic rising to meet her. From this height, the cars looked like toys, the people like ants. It was a disembodying perspective, making everything seem small and insignificant. She found Sophia in the kitchen, a gleaming expanse of stainless steel and white marble that looked as though it had never been used. The older woman was polishing an already spotless countertop. She nodded at Amara, her expression as neutral as the decor. "Coffee is fresh," she said, gesturing to a high-tech machine. "There is fruit, yogurt. Help yourself." Amara poured a coffee, her hands still not quite steady. The warmth of the mug was a small comfort. "Where is Mr. Volpe?" "He left before dawn," Sophia replied, not looking up from her work. "He has business." The word business hung in the air, laden with unspoken menace. Amara imagined dark meetings in smoke-filled rooms, quiet threats, and sudden violence. She shuddered, pushing the thought away. "And the child?" Amara asked, remembering the brief glimpse of a small, silent figure she thought she'd seen in a doorway the night before. Sophia's hand stilled. She finally looked at Amara, her gaze sharp and appraising. "Isabella, Mr. Volpe's sister. She stays in her wing. She does not receive visitors." The finality in her tone discouraged further questions. Amara spent the morning in a state of suspended animation. She wandered the vast, empty rooms, feeling like a ghost haunting a life that was not her own. She ran her fingers along the spines of unread books in a cavernous library, stared at the bold, unsettling art on the walls, and stood before the windows, watching the city live a life that no longer included her. This was not protection, it was erasure. She was being held in a state of perfect, sterile limbo. Around noon, Nico's driver, the same silent, stony-faced man from the night before, arrived with 2 suitcases. Her suitcases. He set them inside the door and left without a word. Amara opened them with a sense of dread. All her meager belongings were there, neatly folded. Her worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, her small collection of jazz records, a framed picture of her and her mother laughing on a park bench. Seeing these small, intimate pieces of her life in this cold, foreign space felt like a violation. Tucked in an envelope on top of her clothes was a bank statement. She opened it with trembling fingers. Her mother's account. A deposit had been made that morning for an amount that made her gasp. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was a payment, a gilded chain. He was taking care of her just as he'd promised, but he was also binding her to him, ensuring her silence and compliance with a generosity that was as terrifying as any threat. Days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last. A suffocating routine of silence and observation settled over Amara. She woke, she ate the food Sophia prepared, she read, she paced. She spoke only to Sophia, and their conversations were brief and functional. Of Nico, she saw almost nothing. He would return late at night, a fleeting shadow passing her door, and be gone again before she woke. His presence filled the apartment even in his absence. It was in the perfect order of everything, the pervasive quiet, the sense of being constantly watched even when she was alone. She learned to read the small signs of his life. A half-empty glass of whiskey left on his study desk, the scent of expensive cologne and cold night air that clung to the hallway after he passed. The faint, almost inaudible sound of a piano being played late at night, just a few melancholy, disjointed chords, always the same short, sad phrase that would drift from the far end of the apartment before abruptly stopping. Her curiosity about the silent child, Isabella, grew into a quiet obsession. She was the other prisoner in this tower, a mystery locked away in the West Wing. Amara would sometimes see her from a distance, a small, pale girl with long, dark hair and eyes that seemed too big for her face. She moved like a wraith through the hallways, never speaking, never making a sound, always flitting away if Amara got too close. There was a profound and bottomless sorrow in the child's eyes that resonated with Amara's own growing sense of hopeless isolation. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for purpose, for something to do, Amara followed the faint, sad melody she sometimes heard at night. It led her to a part of the apartment she hadn't explored, to a set of double doors that were slightly ajar. Peeking inside, she found a music room. It was the only room in the penthouse that showed signs of neglect. A grand piano, its wood a rich mahogany, was coated in a fine layer of dust. Sheet music was scattered on a nearby chair, yellowed with age. A cello leaned in a corner, its strings slack. It was a room frozen in time, a shrine to a life that had been abruptly halted. This, she sensed, was the source of the apartment's soul-deep sadness. She stepped inside, her feet silent on the thick rug. She ran a finger over the piano keys, leaving a clean streak in the dust. She felt a strange pull to this room, a connection to the ghost of the music that once filled it. This was a place of feeling in a home designed to have none. A small sound from the doorway made her turn. Isabella was standing there, her small frame silhouetted against the bright light of the hall. She was staring at Amara, her expression not fearful, but intensely curious. Her gaze was fixed on Amara's hand, still resting on the dusty piano. Amara smiled, a gentle, hesitant expression. She didn't speak, sensing that words would shatter the fragile moment. Instead, she sat down on the piano bench and with one finger slowly picked out the simple, haunting melody she had heard Nico play. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, sol, fa, mi, re, do. A child's tune, simple and heartbreakingly sad. Isabella took a tentative step into the room, then another. She came to stand beside the piano, her eyes wide, watching Amara's finger press the keys. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. In the shared silence of the dusty music room, a silent, fragile understanding passed between the two lonely inhabitants of the glass tower. For the first time since she had been brought here, Amara felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a tiny, fragile seed of connection, planted in the shared soil of their quiet sorrow. The music room became Amara's sanctuary. She began spending her afternoons there, armed with soft cloths and lemon oil she'd procured from a reluctant Sophia. The work was methodical, grounding, polishing the rich mahogany of the piano until it gleamed, dusting, the cello carefully organizing the yellowed sheet music. She was not just cleaning a room, she was tending to a wound. With each swipe of the cloth, she felt she was wiping away some of the stagnant grief that choked the penthouse, letting in a little more air, a little more light. Isabella became her silent companion. The little girl would slip into the room and watch from a corner armchair, her large dark eyes following Amara's every move. She never spoke, but her presence was a quiet validation. Amara would talk to her in a low, gentle voice, not asking questions or demanding answers, but simply narrating her tasks. This music is by a man named Bach. He had many children, you know. I imagine his house was never this quiet. Or, your mother must have loved this room very much. It has a warm feeling under all the dust. She learned through Sophia's clipped remarks that the music room had belonged to Nico and Isabella's mother, a concert-level pianist. It had been sealed, emotionally if not physically, since her death years ago. Sophia disapproved of Amara's presence there, but she did not forbid it, perhaps noticing the subtle change in Isabella. The child seemed less like a ghost now, her movements less furtive, the shadows under her eyes a little less pronounced. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of music, Amara found a simple beginner's piano book. She sat at the bench and, using the knowledge from a few years of childhood lessons, began to pick out a simple lullaby. The notes were hesitant and uneven, but the melody was sweet and clear in the quiet room. Isabella, who had been curled in the armchair, slid to the floor and crept closer. She stood by Amara's elbow, her small head tilted, listening intently. When Amara finished, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was expectant. On an impulse, Amara took Isabella's small hand and placed her index finger on a middle C key. "This is the first note," Amara whispered. "It's where everything begins." She gently pressed the child's finger. The single, clear note hung in the air. Isabella stared at the key, then at her own finger, a flicker of wonder in her eyes. It was a tiny breakthrough, a moment of shared creation that felt monumental. That evening, Nico Volpe came home earlier than usual. Amara heard the soft click of the elevator door and the sound of his footsteps in the hall. She was in the main living area, curled on one of the immense sofas with a book, a habit she'd developed to feel less like a prisoner in her room. He stopped in the archway, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere, making the air crackle with a familiar tension. He was holding his jacket, his tie loosened. He looked tired. His eyes scanned the room and landed on her. For a moment, she thought he would ignore her as usual and continue to his study. But he didn't. "Sophia tells me you've been cleaning my mother's music." "Room?" he said. His voice was not accusatory, merely flat, a statement of fact. Amara's heart began to beat a little faster. She closed her book, marking her page with her finger. "It seemed a shame to let it gather dust," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's a beautiful room." He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She braced herself for a reprimand, to be told she had overstepped, that she had trespassed on sacred ground. "Isabella has been spending time in there with you," he stated. "Yes," Amara said. "She listens. Sometimes she watches me play." She decided against mentioning the moment at the piano, feeling it was too private, too fragile to be exposed to his cold scrutiny. Nico's gaze drifted towards the hallway that led to the music room. A complex, unidentifiable emotion flickered in his eyes, so fleeting she might have imagined it. Was it pain, resentment, or something else entirely? "My mother played," he said, his voice low, almost rough. "Every day." It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. A small, simple crack in the marble facade. He was not just a crime boss, a protector, a jailer. He was a son who had lost his mother. The knowledge shifted something inside Amara. It made him infinitesimally more human. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply gave a curt nod and turned, walking towards his study. But the brief exchange lingered in the air long after he was gone. It was not warmth, not yet. But it was a change in the atmospheric pressure, a recognition of her existence beyond that of a vulnerability to be managed. He saw what she was doing with his sister in his mother's room, and he hadn't told her to stop. In Nico Volpe's silent world, that was the equivalent of a shouted approval. It was the first faint glimmer of light in the long, deep shadow. The fragile truce established by the music room was shattered a week later. The day began like any other in the gilded cage. Amara had spent the morning reading, the afternoon in the music room with Isabella, who had progressed to pressing the keys herself, creating small, dissonant chords that were, to Amara, the most beautiful music in the world. A delivery arrived in the late afternoon. Sophia answered the door to a uniformed courier holding a large, beautifully wrapped box of pastries from a renowned local bakery. "A gift for Miss Amara," the courier said, reading from a slip. Sophia, ever cautious, accepted the box with a suspicious frown. "Who is it from?" "The sender wished to remain anonymous," the man replied with a professional smile, tipping his cap before departing. Sophia brought the box into the kitchen, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Anonymous gifts are rarely a good sign in this house." Amara came to look, drawn by the unusual activity. The box was tied with a silk ribbon, the bakery's logo embossed in gold. It looked innocent, even festive. "Maybe it's from Mr. Volpe," she suggested, though the idea of him sending pastries seemed absurdly out of character. "He does not send pastries," Sophia stated flatly. She began to untie the ribbon, her movements slow and deliberate. As she lifted the lid, a strange almond-like scent, sharp and chemical, wafted out. It was faint, almost entirely masked by the sweet aroma of sugar and butter. But it was there. Amara, who had spent years in kitchens, recognized it instantly from a long-ago safety briefing about cleaning chemicals. Cyanide. Her blood ran cold. "Sophia, don't!" she cried out, grabbing the older woman's arm. Sophia froze, her eyes wide with alarm. She looked from Amara's terrified face to the box of pristine cannolis and eclairs. At that exact moment, the private elevator chimed, and Nico stepped into the apartment. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Amara's panicked expression, Sophia's frozen posture, the open box on the counter. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, crossing the vast room in a few long strides. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "The smell," Amara whispered, her throat tight. "It smells like bitter almonds, like poison." Nico's eyes narrowed. He leaned over the box, taking a short, sharp sniff. His face became a mask of cold fury. He straightened up, his hand going to the inside of his jacket, where Amara knew he kept a gun. "Sophia, get Isabella to her room. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me," he commanded. His voice was calm, but it was the calmness of a bomb before it detonates. Sophia, pale but composed, nodded and hurried from the room. Nico turned to Amara. "You with me." He grabbed her arm, his grip hard and urgent, and pulled her towards his study. It was a large, imposing room, dominated by a massive mahogany desk. One wall was lined with books, another with what looked like reinforced steel. He shoved her behind the desk, pushing her down until she was crouching on the floor. "Stay down and stay quiet," he ordered. He went to the window, peering cautiously through the blinds. He pulled out his phone, his thumb flying across the screen as he sent a series of rapid-fire texts. Then he stood by the door of the study, gun in hand, listening. The silence in the apartment was absolute, a ringing, terrifying void. Amara crouched behind the desk, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was real. The threat wasn't just a lingering possibility anymore. It had found its way into the fortress, past the doorman and the security, delivered with a smile and a silk ribbon. Marco. It had to be Marco. He hadn't forgotten about her. He was trying to eliminate the witness. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Every creak of the building, every distant siren made her jump. Nico remained as still as a statue, a sentinel of coiled violence, waiting for a threat. Finally, his phone buzzed. He read the message, and the tension in his shoulders seemed to lessen by a fraction. He holstered his weapon. "He's clean," Nico said, more to himself than to her. The courier was legitimate. The order was placed online with a stolen credit card. A ghost. He looked at Amara, his eyes dark and intense. "He knows where you are." The words hung in the air, a death sentence. The illusion of safety, of the penthouse as an impregnable fortress, was shattered. "What? What are you going to do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am going to end this," he said, his voice laced with ice. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time she saw a chink in his armor. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, calculating rage. But underneath it, there was something else. A flicker of responsibility. She was his charge. An attack on her was an attack on him, an insult to his power and his protection. In that moment, they were no longer jailer and prisoner. The shared threat had forged a new, unwilling bond between them. They were allies, bound by the shared challenge of survival. He had to trust her instincts, the quick thinking that had identified the danger. And she, more than ever, had to trust his ability to navigate this brutal world. "Tell me again," he said, pulling a chair from the wall and sitting opposite her, his knees almost touching hers. "Everything you saw that night at the restaurant, every detail about Marco, his words, the way he looked at me, the way he moved. Don't leave anything out." And so Amara began to talk. Crouching in the shadow of his desk, with the scent of poison still lingering in the apartment, she gave Nico Volpe the weapon he needed. She gave him her memory. The cold truce was over. The war had begun. The aftermath of the failed poisoning attempt transformed the penthouse. The oppressive quiet was replaced by a low thrum of activity. Men in dark suits with watchful eyes and holsters bulging beneath their jackets appeared in the lobby and hallways. They spoke in low murmurs, their presence a constant unsettling reminder of the danger that now lapped at the edges of their gilded cage. Amara was no longer simply confined. She was under guard. But the dynamic between her and Nico had fundamentally shifted. He no longer treated her as a piece of fragile cargo. He treated her as an asset. He would summon her to his study, the room now a command center with maps of the city and stacks of files on the desk, and have her recount the events at the restaurant again and again. He was searching for a weakness, a mistake Marco might have made, a detail she might have overlooked. He was sweating, she said during one of these interrogations, the memory suddenly surfacing. It wasn't a warm night, but there was a sheen on his forehead. He kept wiping his palm on his trousers before he clapped you on. The shoulder? Nico's eyes narrowed. He was nervous, he mused, a predator scenting weakness. Good. That's good. Nervous men make mistakes. She saw a side of him she hadn't seen before. The strategist. He was methodical, patient, his mind a razor-sharp instrument dissecting the problem piece by piece. He moved his people around the city like chess pieces, gathering information, applying pressure, tightening a silent, invisible net around his cousin. Amara, in turn, found a strange, grim purpose in her confinement. She was no longer just a passive victim of circumstance. She was a participant. Her observation, her memory, was the key. This realization did not lessen her fear, but it tempered it with a sliver of agency. Her bond with Isabella also deepened. The child seemed to sense the heightened tension in the apartment and clung to Amara's presence like a lifeline. She would bring her books to the music room, sitting at Amara's feet while she played simple scales on the piano, the steady, repetitive notes a calming influence in the chaotic atmosphere. One evening, Amara was in the music room, playing the sad, simple melody she'd heard Nico play, when Isabella tugged on her sleeve. The child pointed towards a closed cabinet in the corner of the room, one Amara had not yet opened. Amara followed her over. The cabinet was unlocked. Inside were several leather-bound photo albums. Isabella pointed to the largest one, her eyes pleading. Amara lifted it out and carried it to the sofa, the little girl scrambling up beside her. Amara opened the first page. It was a window into a world before the silence, before the shadows. Pictures of a vibrant, laughing woman with kind eyes and a brilliant smile. Their mother. A handsome, proud man with his arm around her. Their father. And 2 children. A young, serious-looking boy, perhaps 10 or 11, with dark, watchful eyes, a boy who was unmistakably Nico, and a smiling toddler with a fistful of cake. Isabella. They were a family, happy, alive, complete. There were pictures at the beach, at a birthday party, in this very music room with their mother at the piano, her hands a blur on the keys, the boy Nico watching her with a look of quiet adoration. Amara felt a profound ache in her chest, a grief for a family she had never known. She glanced at Isabella, who was tracing the outline of her mother's face with a small, trembling finger. She was beautiful, Amara whispered. Isabella looked up at her and gave a small, solemn nod. It was the most communicative gesture Amara had ever seen her make. They sat for a long time, turning the pages, sharing the silent story of the family that had been shattered. Later that night, the crisis reached its peak. Nico returned to the apartment, and Amara knew from the moment he stepped out of the elevator that something was wrong. The air of controlled tension he usually carried had been replaced by a grim, final stillness. 2 of his men followed him in, their faces hard and set. "Amara," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "I need you to identify someone." One of the men produced a tablet and handed it to her. It displayed a grainy security camera image. It was from the lobby of a downtown hotel. A man was at the front desk, his back mostly to the camera, but his profile was visible for a split second as he turned. "Is this the courier who delivered the package?" Nico asked. Amara studied the image, her heart pounding. The build was right, the uniform, but the face. It was someone she had seen before, not the courier. Her mind raced, sifting through the memories of the Onyx Room. The patrons? The staff? "No," she said, shaking her head. "That's not him. That's That's one of the busboys from the restaurant. His name is Leo. He works the dinner shift." Nico's eyes locked onto hers, a flicker of triumphant, cold fire in their depths. He had found the mistake. Marco hadn't used a ghost. He had used a pawn, a disposable employee from the scene of the crime, someone he could pressure or pay off, someone who could be found. "Thank you, Amara," Nico said softly. He took the tablet back and turned to his men. "You have your orders." The men nodded and left. The finality of the moment was chilling. Amara knew with absolute certainty that she had just condemned two men, Leo, the busboy, and Marco, the mastermind. She felt a wave of nausea. Nico walked to the great glass windows and stared out at the city lights. He stood there for a long time, his back to her. Amara didn't know what to do. She couldn't leave. She couldn't speak. She could only stand there, a witness to the final silent move in a deadly game. "It's done," he said at last, his voice rough. He sounded tired, hollowed out. The victory, it seemed, brought him no joy. "It's over. You're safe now." The tension that had held the apartment in its grip for days finally snapped. The adrenaline drained out of Amara, leaving her weak and trembling. Safe. The word sounded foreign. "What will happen to him?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Nico turned from the window. His face was pale in the moonlight, his eyes shadowed and ancient. "Justice," he said. "My family has its own justice." That night a storm broke over the city. Rain lashed against the windows of the penthouse, and distant thunder rumbled like a prophecy fulfilled. The violence of the weather mirrored the turmoil that had finally been purged from their lives, leaving behind a raw, unsettling quiet. Amara couldn't sleep. She found herself wandering the dark apartment, eventually ending up in the hallway outside Isabella's room. A thin sliver of light shone from under the door. She heard a sound, a small muffled cry, a whimper of distress. Hesitantly, she pushed the door open. The room was lit by a small bedside lamp. Isabella was thrashing in her bed, caught in the grips of a nightmare, her face contorted in silent terror. Sophia was there, trying to soothe her, murmuring gentle words that had no effect. "She's been like this for an hour," Sophia said, her face etched with worry. "The storm frightens her." Just then, Nico appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. He took in the scene, and a look of profound pain crossed his face, a raw, unguarded anguish that startled Amara. He walked to the bed and gently moved Sophia aside. He sat on the edge of the mattress and gathered his small, trembling sister into his arms. He held her close, rocking her gently, his large frame curved protectively around her. "Shh, Isabella," he murmured, his voice a low, rough sound Amara had never heard before. It was a voice stripped of all its cold authority, filled with a desperate, aching tenderness. "It's just thunder. You're safe. I'm here. I'm always here." But the child continued to struggle, her small hands pushing against his chest, her silent screams trapped behind her sealed lips. Nico's own control began to fray. He buried his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking with a suppressed sob. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words a raw, broken confession meant only for his sister, but overheard by Amara in the shadows of the room. "I'm so sorry. I should have been faster. I should have saved them." Amara's heart broke for him, for both of them. This was the source of it all, the wound that had never healed, the silence, the coldness, the control. It was all a fortress he had built around this one, devastating failure. She didn't know what moved her, but she stepped forward. She went to the other side of the bed and knelt down, so her face was level with Isabella's. She took the child's free hand in her own. It was cold and clammy. "Isabella," Amara said softly, her voice steady and calm amidst the storm inside and out. "Listen to my voice. It's just Amara. You're not there anymore. You're here, in your room, and Nico is with you. We're both with you." She began to hum the simple lullaby from the music room, the one she had been teaching Isabella on the piano. Slowly, miraculously, the child's struggles began to subside. Her frantic breathing evened out. She turned her head, her tear-filled eyes focusing on Amara. She was still trembling, but the terror was receding, replaced by a dawning awareness. Her little hand tightened its grip on Amara's. They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them a strange tableau of shared grief and comfort, the broken brother, the silent sister, and the woman who had stumbled into their lives. Nico continued to rock Isabella, his own ragged breathing slowly calming. Amara continued to hum, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. Eventually, Isabella's eyes fluttered shut, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, her hand still clutching Amara's. Carefully, Nico laid her back against the pillows, tucking the covers around her. He stood up, his movements stiff. He looked across the bed at Amara, who was still kneeling on the floor. The mask was gone. In its place was a man who looked utterly exhausted, stripped bare by the ghosts of his past. The storm outside was beginning to pass, the thunder fading into a distant grumble. He gestured with his head towards the door. Amara rose and followed him out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind her. They stood in the dim light, the silence between them no longer cold and empty, but thick with unspoken emotion. "You've never seen a child have a nightmare before?" Amara asked gently, trying to fill the void. Nico leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. "I've seen it every night for 10 years, he said, his voice raw. "I was there, you know." Amara waited, knowing he needed to say this, to let the poison out. "The night my parents were killed, it was a business dispute, a betrayal from someone we trusted. They came to the house. I was 12. Isabella was 2. My father told me to take her and hide, to be quiet, no matter what I heard." His voice cracked. "So I did. We hid in a closet upstairs, and we listened. We heard everything." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a decade of unshed tears. "She hasn't spoken a word since that night. The doctor said it was trauma, that she locked the words away with the memory. And I locked everything else away. I built this place, this life, to keep her safe, to make sure nothing and no one could ever touch her again. I thought if I could control everything, I could stop the past from happening again." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "But it's always here, in the quiet, in her eyes." He finally looked at her, and the vulnerability in his gaze was a physical blow. "I don't know how to reach her. I try, but all I have to give her is this." He gestured vaguely at the opulent, empty hallway. "And it's not enough." "You give her your love," Amara said softly. "She knows that, but she's lonely. You both are." In that moment, standing in the dark hallway of the silent penthouse, the truth of their situation settled over Amara. He hadn't just been protecting her from Marco. He had been protecting her from the world, just as he tried to protect Isabella. It was the only way he knew how to care for someone. He built walls. "She let you in," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "The music room? She never went in there. And tonight, you reached her, when I couldn't." "I just gave her a different kind of quiet," Amara replied. "A quiet with music in it, not an empty one." He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Not as a problem, not as a witness, not as a charge, but as Amara. The woman who had calmed his sister's storm. The woman who had, with a simple act of quiet compassion, breached the walls he had spent a decade building. The revelation hung between them, a fragile, beautiful, terrifying thing. The foundation of their world had been shattered, and in its place, something new and uncertain was beginning to grow. The days following the storm were quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. The tension was gone, replaced by a sense of weary peace. The extra security vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The threat of Marco Vella was neutralized, a dark chapter closed with brutal, unspoken finality. The penthouse returned to its state of pristine calm, but something fundamental had changed within its glass walls. The air felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive. The confession in the hallway had acted as a lancing of a wound. The poison of the past, held in for so long, had been let out, and now healing could begin. The wall between Nico and Amara had not so much crumbled as become translucent. She could see the man behind the myth now, the grieving son, the fiercely protective brother, the lonely man trapped in a fortress of his own making. He began to spend more time at the penthouse. He no longer disappeared before dawn, and he would often return in the early evening. He would join her for the simple dinners Sophia prepared, sitting in silence at the opposite end of the long dining table. But the silence was different now. It was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a shared space, a comfortable quiet that acknowledged the deep, unspoken things that had passed between them. Amara continued her time in the music room. It had become the heart of the home. She found a local piano tuner's number and, after a brief, hesitant conversation with Nico, received his permission to have the grand piano serviced. The tuner, a wizened old man with gentle hands, spent an entire afternoon working his magic, and when he was finished, the piano sang with a richness and clarity it hadn't possessed in years. The first time Amara played it after the tuning, the difference was astounding. The notes were full and resonant, filling the once dusty room with life. She was playing a simple piece by Chopin when Nico appeared in the doorway. He didn't speak, just leaned against the frame, his arms crossed, and listened. He had his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked less like a crime lord and more like a man at home. When she finished, the last note hanging in the air, he spoke. "My mother used to play that," he said, his voice soft. "I found the sheet music," Amara said, gesturing to the stand. "It's beautiful." He walked into the room, running his hand over the polished surface of the piano. "She would be happy," he said, "to hear music in here again." He looked at Amara, a real, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, erasing the harsh lines and revealing a startling warmth. "Thank you, Amara." The simple words, filled with a sincerity she had never heard from him before, made her heart flutter. "You're welcome, Nico." It was the first time she had used his given name. It felt natural, right? Their turning point, the moment the unspoken connection between them finally broke the surface, came a few days later. It was a bright, clear afternoon. Amara was at the piano, showing Isabella how to play a simple duet, their 4 small hands working together on the keys. They were laughing, a real musical laugh from Amara and a silent, breathy one from Isabella, when the child did something extraordinary. As they finished the song with a final triumphant chord, Isabella looked up at Amara, her eyes shining. And then she spoke. It was just one word, a tiny, raspy whisper. Again. Amara froze, her hands hovering over the keys. She stared at the little girl, whose face was alight with a mixture of shock and pride at the sound of her own voice. "What did you say, sweetie?" Amara asked, her voice trembling. "Again," Isabella repeated, a little louder this time, a real word, clear and certain. She pointed a small finger at the sheet music. Tears welled in Amara's eyes. She hugged the little girl, burying her face in her dark hair, overwhelmed with a wave of emotion. 10 years of silence, broken by a simple request for more music. At that moment, Nico walked in. He had been on his way to his study, but he stopped dead in the doorway, having heard the exchange. He stared at his sister, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning, radiant joy. "Bella?" he whispered, using a childhood nickname that was so full of love it made Amara's chest ache. Isabella turned to him. A brilliant, fearless smile spread across her face. "Nico," she said, her voice still quiet, but there. It was there. Nico crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt before his sister's chair, taking her small hands in his. He looked from her to Amara, his eyes shining with an emotion so powerful, so raw, it took Amara's breath away. It was gratitude, it was wonder, it was a love so profound, it was humbling to witness. He didn't need to say anything. Everything was there in his eyes. He stood up, his gaze still locked with Amara's. He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth and tenderness that shot through her entire body. The years of loneliness, the coldness, the fear, it all melted away in that single reverent touch. The world narrowed to the space between them, the shared air, the unspoken understanding. He was no longer the shadow, the feared Mafia boss. He was just Nico, a man who had been given back a piece of his heart. And she was Amara, the woman who had shown him it was possible. He leaned in, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. She couldn't. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. His lips met hers, and the kiss was not one of passion or demand, but of profound, soul-deep gratitude. It was soft, it was hesitant, it was a question and an answer all at once. It was a promise of a new beginning, a declaration that the silence was well and truly over. In the heart of the music room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the hope of the future, their 2 lonely worlds finally, irrevocably, became one. The kiss changed everything. It was a line drawn in the sand, separating the cold, uncertain past from a future that was suddenly, dazzlingly bright with possibility. When they broke apart, the air in the music room was thick with a new, fragile intimacy. Nico's hand still rested on her shoulders, his gaze so open and full of emotion it made her feel as though she were seeing him for the very first time. Isabella watched them, her head tilted, a small, knowing smile on her face. It was as if she, the silent observer, had understood the trajectory of their hearts long before they had. "Amara," Nico said, his voice low and thick with feeling. He seemed to be struggling for words, a rare state for a man whose commands were usually so precise. He didn't need to finish. She understood. She reached up and placed her hand over his on her shoulder, a simple gesture of acceptance and reassurance. In the days that followed, a gentle courtship began. It was a romance conducted in quiet moments and shared glances. It was in the way he started seeking her out, not for information, but for her company. He would find her in the library and simply sit in the armchair opposite, reading his own book, the companionable silence, a world away from the tense emptiness that had once defined the penthouse. He would ask her about her day, about her mother, about the books she was reading, his questions showing a genuine desire to know her, the person, not just the witness he was protecting. He took her to the rooftop terrace, a space she hadn't even known existed. It was a secret garden in the sky, filled with potted trees and flowering plants that Sophia, it turned out, tended with quiet devotion. They stood by the railing as the sun set, the city lights beginning to twinkle to life below them, a sea of diamonds scattered on black velvet. "I've never brought anyone else up here," he confessed, his shoulder brushing against hers. "Only Bella when she was very small." "It's beautiful," Amara said, breathing in the cool, clean air. "It feels like you're on top of the world." For a long time it felt like the opposite, he said, his gaze distant. Like I was looking down on a world I couldn't be a part of. A world with light and noise and people who weren't afraid. I built this tower to be safe, but I just built a taller prison. He turned to her, his expression serious. You changed that, Amara. You walked into this prison and you filled it with music. You gave my sister back her voice. You're giving me back mine." It was the most honest, vulnerable declaration he could have made. He wasn't just a man who had fallen in love. He was a man who was being brought back to life. "You were never truly silent, Nico," she said softly, her hand finding his on the railing. "I heard you, even when you weren't speaking." Their relationship was not a whirlwind. It was a slow, deliberate construction built on a foundation of shared trauma and mutual healing. They were two careful, wounded souls learning to trust again, not just each other, but the very idea of happiness itself. One evening, he came to her room. He knocked softly on the door, a courtesy he had never extended before. When she opened it, he was standing there, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to be honest. There are no wrong answers." She nodded, her heart beating a little faster. "The threat is gone. Marco is no longer a problem. You are free to go, Amara. I will see to it that you and your mother are set up for life, anywhere you want to be. You will be safe, and you will never have to see me or this world again. Your old life is gone, but I can give you a new one, a free one." He was offering her an exit, an escape from the gilded cage. It was the most honorable, selfless thing he could do. He was giving her back the choice that had been taken from her that night at the restaurant. Amara looked at him, at this powerful, dangerous, broken, and beautiful man. She thought of the life he was describing, a quiet, safe life, free from shadows and fear, a life without him. And she felt nothing but a profound, aching emptiness at the thought. She thought of the cold, impersonal penthouse she had first entered and what it had become. A place where a little girl's voice had returned, a place where music was played, a place where two lonely people had found each other in the dark. It was no longer a cage. It was a home. "And what if I don't want a new life?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "What if the life I want is here?" Relief washed over his features, so powerful it was as if a physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "Amara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I cannot imagine this house, my life, without you in it. I know what I am. I know the world I live in is dark and complicated. I never thought I could ask anyone to share it with me. But I am asking now. Stay with me, not as my ward, not as my prisoner, as my partner, as my everything." Tears streamed down her face, tears of joy and relief. "I thought you'd never ask," she whispered. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, and she felt the steady, strong beat of his heart against her cheek. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of her future. 6 months later, the penthouse was unrecognizable. The stark, minimalist furniture had been softened with warm throws and colorful cushions. Vases of fresh flowers, which Amara arranged every few days, sat on tables and windowsills, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the once monochromatic scheme. The scent of lemon oil and roses had replaced the sterile emptiness. The sound of the home had changed, too. It was no longer defined by silence. Laughter, something once entirely alien to these walls, was a frequent occurrence. Most of it came from Isabella, who now chattered away, her voice growing stronger and more confident every day. She was enrolled in a special school for the arts and had discovered a passion for painting, her colorful, abstract canvases now hanging on the walls where the cold, impersonal art had once been. The music room remained the heart of the home. Amara and Nico often spent their evenings there. She would play the piano while he sat in the armchair, not reading, but simply watching her, a look of quiet contentment on his face. Sometimes Isabella would join them, and the three of them would play silly duets, their laughter echoing through the halls. Amara had found her place not just in Nico's home, but in his life. She was his confidant, his anchor, the one person who saw the man, not the myth. She helped him temper his cold instincts with compassion, reminding him of the humanity that his world so often tried to extinguish. He, in turn, gave her a security and a depth of love she had never imagined possible. His dangerous world still existed outside the penthouse walls, but it no longer touched them within. He had built the fortress to keep the world out, but with Amara he had finally created a sanctuary within it. Her mother was healthy and happy, living in a comfortable new home nearby, doting on Isabella and treating Nico with a cautious but genuine affection. She saw the light her daughter had brought back to his eyes and was grateful. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop terrace, watching the city sparkle below, Nico wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Do you remember the first time I brought you up here?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I told you I felt like I was in a prison, looking at a world I couldn't be a part of." "I remember," she said, leaning back against his chest. "It's funny," he continued. "I'm in the same place, looking at the same view, but now I feel like I'm at the center of the entire world, because my world is right here, in my arms." Amara turned in his embrace, her hands coming up to cup his face. The love she felt for him was a fierce, steady flame. They had found each other in the darkest of moments, two strangers thrown together by an act of violence. But from that poison, they had cultivated something beautiful and true. They had healed each other's silence. She smiled, her heart full. "It's good to be home," she said. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was. Dear listener, isn't it remarkable how a single moment, a single choice born of courage, can reroute the entire course of a life? Amara was a waitress, living a life of quiet obligation when she chose to act. She chose to see the person behind the fearsome reputation, to risk everything for a stranger's safety. Her story reminds us that the most profound changes in our lives and in the lives of others often begin with a small, seemingly insignificant act of compassion. We all build walls. Like Nico, we construct fortresses around our hearts to protect ourselves from past hurts and future fears. We create silence and distance, believing it's the only way to stay safe. But Amara's journey into his life shows us that true safety isn't found in isolation. It's found in connection. It's found when we have the courage to let someone past our defenses, someone who isn't afraid of our silent, dusty rooms, someone who sees the music waiting to be played again. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to reach out, to slide that note of warning, to offer a moment of comfort, to hum a simple tune in a room that has been silent for too long. You never know whose life you might save, whose voice you might help unlock. And in doing so, you might just find the one person who was meant to heal your own silence, and finally, lead you home. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even in the darkest of shadows, a single act of kindness can let the light in.